We've had a great morning so far. We had our first focus group this morning. We had a great group that came in. We've got another group due in at 1 o'clock, another one due in at 3 o'clock. The 1 o'clock is filled. The 3 o'clock still has a few slots. And there are slots open next week as well, 8:30, 1, and 3. So if you're not signed up, we'd love for you to come and be a part of that. We're having some great discussions about the future of this church and kind of where we're going from there. Most of you have seen the last two sermons, the CHA and then options. If you haven't watched that, be sure and take a look at those kind of in preparation for those group meetings and be in prayer about that. I know you all have been. What else? I think that's all my business to do. Quick review. We've been in a series on the life of Joseph, the last third of the book of Genesis, Genesis 37. Oh, I wanted to visit. We got a lot of visitors this morning. It was the ice. The brain is still not thawed yet. Glad to have all our visitors that are with us this morning. Want to meet you and get to know you and welcome you to Skillman. Glad to have you this morning. To the visitors, we've been in a study of the life of Joseph. The last third of the book of Genesis is on the life of Joseph, 37 through 50, and it's an answer to a very interesting question. The big question behind those 13 chapters is, how is God going to lead in this world? So he creates the world, he establishes his people with Abraham and gives Abraham that promise, and then the question is, all right, now that God's created this world, how's he going to manage it? How is he going to work through our lives? And the story of Joseph is the story of God's purpose working through one individual's life. And we said in the introduction, I'm getting you caught up in about a minute and a half here, but we said in the introduction, God's doing four things in this story of Joseph. And you remember the story. There's lots of great stories, coat of many colors, and he's in the pit, and he is interpreter of Pharaoh's dreams. But there's four things going on all simultaneously that God's working on. One, he is trying to heal a family that's fractured. Joseph and his brothers have all kinds of problems. Two, he's going to try and save a world from famine. The famine's coming in Egypt and across the world. Three, he is going to try and create a nation. So by the end of this story, Joseph and his brothers will be in Egypt, and that's the start of the Israelite nation. So a nation's being formed. And fourth, this is a story about the correct use of power. Joseph is a boy born to rule. And looking at the life of Joseph, it's a study of what do you do if you are in power. And getting into the story today, we're really going to begin to see the seeds of that begin. Today we're in Genesis chapter 39, which is one of my favorite stories. It's one of the most famous in the book, which is the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. We'll have the verses up there on the screen, and we'll be going through this particular chapter kind of quickly and be making three major points at the end of it. There's three things kind of going on here. Most of you know the story, but in this section of Genesis, it is the beginning of three stories in a row. There's Joseph and Potiphar's wife. There is Joseph interpreting the butler and the baker's dreams. We'll get to that next week. And then there's going to be Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dreams. So you have these three stories in the narrative leading up to Joseph coming into the service of Pharaoh. And as we study the life of Joseph, it's very much like a board game that I played when I was growing up. Do you all remember the board game Chutes and Ladders? Do you all remember that thing, or am I just like way old and ancient? Chutes and Ladders was a game where you had your little piece and you'd roll, and if you hit a ladder, you'd go up and you'd jump a few lines, right? And you'd get right to the top, which was you're the winner. And there was a big chute that went all the way back down. Do y'all remember that? And it was about 3 blocks out, and I'd always hit the chute and lose. And Sarah, I've got to work through those childhood issues, I guess. But be that as it may, you'd go through and you'd hit ladders and you'd do a little bit better, and you'd hit a chute and do a little worse, and better and worse, and better and worse. And that was chutes and ladders. And the story of Joseph is really the story of chutes and ladders, because just about the time he thinks he's got his legs underneath him and everything's going to be okay, what happens? The bottom falls out again. And so there's this roller coaster of events that occur as he's going through his life. And it's already occurred once. He was loved by his dad, given that robe, and then he's sold by his brothers into slavery. So the Ishmaelites have carried him into Egypt, and that's where we left off a couple of weeks ago. So we're going to pick up with 39 in verse 1 and look at the first segment in this narrative, which is verses 1 through 6. So let's pick up and read there. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered and lived in the house of the Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So he left in Joseph's care everything he had with Joseph in charge. He did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. Okay, a couple of things about this first paragraph, which is, it's giving us an introduction to Joseph entering the empire of Egypt. The first thing that we hear about Joseph is the fact that he's coming into Potiphar's house. Now, we don't know a lot about this guy, but he wasn't just your average, ordinary corporal or just average infantryman. He's in Pharaoh's guard, and he's captain of that guard. So this is someone, number one, of some influence, number two, of some ability, and number three, someone of some means, because he has a whole household that he puts Joseph in charge of. The thing we're going to see is that before Joseph ever arrives in Pharaoh's court as second in command, he's going to have some very key experiences preparing him for that. And this is the first one. And that is, he is working for a guy whose boss is the emperor of Egypt. He's fixing to work for this guy, so every time this guy comes home and drinking coffee, and how was your day today? And he's telling stories about the guy that Joseph eventually is going to work with. Does that make sense? There have been times in my life where I've been placed in situations that were not particularly pleasant, and I went, why am I here and what am I doing? And the answer to that was, it's getting you ready for something later on down the road. Shut up and go through with it. You ever been there? And that's what's going on with Joseph here. He's getting an orientation to the court of Pharaoh from the guy that runs the thing. Does that make sense? And that's who this guy was. So it's a marvelous experience. Once again, God's working his ways, but he's doing it behind the scenes in a very sublime kind of way. The second thing that's real interesting about this paragraph is over and over and over again, it says, God was with Joseph. God was with him. God was with him. The Egyptians saw that God was with him and turned over everything in his household to him. In verses 2, it says it. In verses 3, it says it. And then when you roll down to verse 23 at the end of the chapter, it's going to say it twice. In the text, when the ancients would write something over and over and over again, when they repeated themselves, that was their way of saying, reader, this is a big deal. And so what the writer is trying to get us to understand is that it was evident to Joseph and evident to everyone around him that there was something very special about this individual, that God was empowering him. In just a moment, he's going to refuse sex from his boss's wife. And one of the reasons he's going to give for that is because he's going to say, I have a knowing of who I am. And that's very, very powerful. It's very, very remarkable. So that first paragraph is, he enters the empire, he is a slave, change of status, he was an Israelite prince, and now he's a slave, and he's doing it successfully, which says a lot about him. Let's go to paragraph 2. Let's go back to 6b and read down through about 10. Now Joseph was well-built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you're his wife. Then how could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. Okay, let's work on this paragraph for just a second, because there's some big stuff going on here that is kind of the meat of the story. And this is the one that everybody has heard. So the first thing that we understand is, the first thing that the writer tells us was, Joseph was what? He was attractive. He was a good-looking guy. He was somebody that women noticed, just like David. The writers of Samuel tell us David was an attractive man. Joseph is carrying on the family heritage. If you go back to Genesis 29, it talks about his mother. And it says, his mother was Rachel. And it says, but Rachel was lovely in form and beautiful. Joseph looked like his mama. Everybody looked, he's a good-looking guy. Incidentally, that same paragraph talks about Rachel's sister. It says, Rachel's sister Leah had weak eyes. Okay, don't you know Leah, when she gets to heaven, is going to have a conversation with Moses about writing the Pentateuch and go, this is the best you could say about me? You know, I get the consolation, I have weak eyes, I needed glasses. Okay, we'll leave that one alone. Attractive guy. And then it says that Potiphar's wife says to him, come to bed with me. That is not a request, that is a command. That is a command, because she owns him. So this is not necessarily seduction American style. This is, I own you, my husband's not here, get in bed with me. And the unstated message is, or else. At this point in time, it's interesting what Joseph doesn't rationalize. When I was growing up, my dad preached some, and I've got all of his old sermon outlines, and they're a priceless treasure to me. And my sister's favorite sermon that he used to do was called Under the Circumstances. And it was a sermon all about the fact that under any circumstances, you can rationalize something away. Isn't it interesting you remember something from your childhood like that? But isn't it interesting, under the circumstances, what Joseph didn't say at this point in time? Because he could have said, well, under the circumstances, this woman owns me, and there's nothing else I can do. I better go ahead and go to bed with her, number one. Or he could have said, I'm a young man, I've never been to bed with a woman, no one will know. Rationalize it away, number three. Or he could have said, this woman can have me what? Killed. Yeah. This is to save my life. Notice that's not what he does. What he does is he orients himself to two things. And I like this. He orients himself, number one, to the Torah, to the Word of God. And when he answers her and says, how could I do such a sin against whom? It's against God. And so he knows who owns him. He knows who owns his integrity. He knows who owns his truth. He knows who owns his sexuality. He knows who owns him. And so on the one hand, he is a man of Torah. He is a man of the Word. He is a man of the commands of God. However, on the other hand, he is a man of what we would call today common sense. what the ancients called the wisdom literature. He basically looks at this situation and says, okay, if I want to get into real deeper trouble, yeah, I'll just go and do that. So even without the Torah, without the God said, there's common sense there that he goes, okay, this is a stupid idea. I had a friend that used to say after elders meetings, a stupid decision prayed over is still a stupid decision. Okay. Sorry about that one. That was not in the notes. I'm not sure where that came from. Shane's going, I'm going on vacation now. That was not directed toward our guys. Old stuff coming up. Let me do one more piece on this. Yesterday I was working with a bunch of beginning marriage and family therapists, and we were talking about extramarital affairs. And there are times when the biblical text and psychology lay over one another perfectly. And this paragraph is one of those. When extramarital affairs occur, they don't just happen kaboom. They're not like music videos where two people get on a glass elevator in a hotel and they're strip off and having sex by the time they get to the 40th floor. It makes good Hollywood, but that's not how it happens. It is a progression. And this paragraph shows the progression that a person can go through to move to an extramarital affair. Let me do it for you real fast. The first step in the affair syndrome is proximity. People have affairs with people they're in proximity to, people they're around. And so Joseph was around Potiphar's wife. Potiphar's wife was around him. They noticed each other. Coaches have affairs with athletes. Teachers have affairs with other teachers. Business people have affairs with people that they call on as clients. People have affairs with people in proximity. Number two, there is an awareness of attraction, and that's what occurred here. Potiphar's wife noticed that Joseph was an attractive guy and said, he's my slave, I believe I'll take him. Step number three in this thing is there is a message sent. And so when people are attracted to one another, they begin flirting with each other. They start sending messages. In this paragraph, she sent a very clear message. What was it? Get in bed. Yeah. Step four is increased interaction. When people are headed to have an affair, they start hanging out with each other. They go to the coffee bar at the same time. They show up at the gym for workouts at the same time. They overlap their schedules. They're both married, but they are dating. Does that make sense? So you get that increased interaction, and then finally you get to where you're shared. And that's what Joseph did. He realized he couldn't back this woman off, and so the text said he wouldn't even go in the house and be around her because he was trying to get away from this thing. And finally they go to increased emotional interaction, to where he starts sharing private stuff, she starts sharing private stuff, and you get that bond going. And we're off to the races. That's the world I live in. And that paragraph demonstrates that beautifully. And the thing Joseph's doing, which shows us his integrity, is he draws the line way back here. And he says, the line is right here. I'm not that man. I'm not that person. It's right with the Torah, and it also makes common sense, even if it gets me killed. That's pretty remarkable stuff if you think about it. We okay? All right, let's move to the final paragraph. So let's go back to the story. Pick up with verse 11. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said, "this Hebrew has been brought to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him, put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. So if the first paragraph is about his entrance into the empire, he is now a slave in Egypt. If the second one is about a seduction, the third paragraph is now an accusation. Come to bed with me is now an accusation that she's going to lodge against him with her husband that ends him in jail. Chutes and ladders. Oops, by the end of the chapter, he's back in the dungeon again. It's very, very interesting. She uses a derogatory term here twice. What was it? That Hebrew. Talk about not politically correct. You can almost hear her hissing when she says it, right? Yeah. It's a depersonalization. Suddenly, the man that she wanted to have sex with is now an object. That Hebrew. Okay. The second thing that's real interesting here is, I'll just throw it out for your consideration, is Joseph keeps being disrobed. You ever notice that? He can't keep his clothes. I mean, he loses the robe. He can't keep the robe on. Now he loses his little servant outfit. He's running around naked, bringing coffee. I don't know what. The writer gives us that as an imagery. I'm playing around with you a little bit, but this disrobing, he keeps the forces of manipulation and the forces of lies and deception keep trying to figuratively disrobe him. But they repeatedly failed. Isn't that interesting? It's also interesting in this story that the bearer of power and the bearer of sexuality and temptation, the bearer of the affair, quote unquote, is not the man, it is the woman. It is the woman that brings the sexual temptation to the story and then will ultimately bring him down. This story is really interesting to me. A number of years ago, a friend of mine called me. He said, "Do you want to get out of academics and go into corporate consulting? We need some people in our change management practice." And I was bored, and I thought, okay, that would be fun to try. So I did. I went to work for Accenture, one of the big consulting firms. Got a contract, and I was flying in to Pittsburgh, go in on Mondays, fly in, work all week, and fly back on Fridays. I was on the bench. No one wanted to recruit me because I was an academic, I was an egghead, and never had any experience doing this. So finally, this woman that was up there working this project, multi-million dollar project, that was redoing claims processing for Blue Cross Blue Shield. So when you'd go to the doctor, when you'd come out, your claim would be processed. Kaboom, big deal. And there were hundreds of people working this thing, big, and I was the new rookie. I didn't know anything was going on. Fly in for the first day of work, take the cab out to the high rise, nervous as I can be because I've never done this before. And my manager, and she had a reputation for being pretty tough and hard-nosed. No one wanted to work to her. She said, "I'll have lunch with you, and I'll tell you what all's involved." Okay. So I show up for the first lunch. We sit down, we're having lunch. She's going through all the requirements. You have to do this and this and this and this and this and this and this. Yes, ma'am, yes, ma'am, yes, ma'am, just saluting the flag. We do the whole lunch, and then she shifted gears. And she went seductive on me. And she said, "You know we're staying in the same hotel." And she said, "I'd like for you to come by after work and get to know you better and let me know that if that took place, that she was going to help me in my launch in the company." Seductive message. I was single at the time. There was no one watching. No one standing over me, this, that, and the other. But I had to decide, am I going to go professional or going to go personal with this thing? And I decided, not going there, not going to do that deal. Did the contract, was there about 5 months maybe, and on Fridays, the big management team would fly in. So you had all the partners there that have lunch to check on everything. So I'm in there 4 or 5 months, and they call me in, and they're all sitting there, this, that, and the other. And they said, Don, you've done this and this and this. Yes, sir, I've done those things. And then they had a sheet of about 10 things, project work samples that had not been touched, hadn't been done. Why haven't you done this and this and this and this and this? And it was the first time I'd ever seen those things. And she was sitting there with her arms folded, just looking at me going, gotcha. Gotcha. And I lost that job. Sex and power. Sex and power. It's as old in the New Testament and it's as new as today, but it's all a part of the world in which we live in. And it's wielded by men, it's wielded by women, and it causes all of us to say, who am I in this world? Does that make sense? Real deal. What is the chapter saying to us? Real quickly, 3 takeaways that I'd like to suggest to you. The first takeaway is Joseph is going to say, I am going to live in the empire. I am going to live by the dictates of Egypt. I'm here in this world, and I'll live on your terms, but there are limits beyond which I will not extend myself. And that's the great question for us as Christians. It is, we will live in the world, but we're not to live of the world. And that balance for each of us is very, very difficult. We're in Dallas, but how are we to be of Dallas? Because we're still to be separate. And it's an interesting dynamic for a church as well. We were talking about this in focus groups this morning. How will Skillman be in this community, but not of it? How are we called out, but called in? And there's no magic answer to that. For Joseph, it's a struggle his whole life, but it is grappling with that struggle that is where we're called in faith. Does that make sense? So how will we be in the world, but not of it? The second thing that's real interesting about this particular story is, as we walk through it, you will not hear Joseph complain for where he is, which is really interesting. He's going to go from being a royal prince in his daddy's house to being a slave and bounce in between those two. Chutes and ladders. But you'll hear him grapple with it, you'll hear him struggle with it, but he'll never look at God and say, you were not fair. This is not the way life was supposed to be. He never takes that step over the line. He recognizes the answer to how does God lead. He recognizes the sovereignty of God, and he recognizes he's God's man. And God can move that piece around the puzzle board however he wishes. And that's a tough thing to own in faith, isn't it? The last thing that we get out of chapter 39 is an understanding of the duality of the walk of faith. On the one hand, life is lived at great risk. We live at great risk. Joseph was at risk from his brothers. Joseph was at risk from Potiphar's wife. Joseph will be at risk from the jailer. He's constantly at risk. He's going to be at risk from the famine. He's constantly at risk. We live at great risk. We live in fear at times of what could happen because we have no control over that. And yet, life is lived at great risk and things are confidently settled. God is God, and he is in charge, and we are his. Read you something real quick. One of my favorite commentators in the world, one of my favorite writers is Walter Brueggemann. Brueggemann's over in Atlanta. He wrote this: life is lived at great risk. It must be lived in the face of deceit, temptation, and seduction. At the same time, it is true that things are confidently settled by God. Life is confidently settled, and life must be lived at great risk. Both are true, either taken by itself are false. And so the story of Joseph is an invitation into an adventure to walk between confidence and risk, fear and certainty, confusion and understanding. And it is into that canyon that we do one thing. We walk by faith. And that's our calling. And that's what Joseph quietly says to us about how God leads. Next week, we'll take a look at Joseph in prison. This morning, if we can minister to you in any way, we're going to sing a song. I'll be down front. Love to talk to you. Love to welcome you into this church. Let's stand together and sing.